rejected an amendment offered by Montana Democrat John Tester to delay the capping of debit card fees. Those caps, which passed into law last year as part of the financial overhaul bill, are due to go into effect next month. An amendment would have delayed them for another year. And now live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Almighty God, life of our life, you have given us this nation for our heritage. Today we ask that you will keep us mindful of your favor and glad to do your will. Use the members of this body to uphold the public interest, to labor for justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with you. Give them the wisdom to use their power for the healing of our land. Keep their goals high, their vision clear, and their minds keen. And Lord, we ask your choicest blessings upon our departing Page class. We pray in your righteous name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., June 9, 2011. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
Majority Leader is recognized.
Following any leader remarks, the Senate will begin a period of morning business for 1 hour, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half. Following morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of the Economic Development Act. There are currently 5 amendments pending to the bill. We're working to set up votes in relation to these amendments and will notify senators on their schedule. Mr. President, this is an important bill. Is it the most important bill we've ever done? The answer, of course not. But it's an important piece of legislation. The Economic Development Revitalization Act is important. What are the central points of this legislation? For almost 50 years, the Economic Development Administration has helped create jobs and growth in economically hard-hit communities across this nation. Reauthorization of this important legislation will help ensure that the agency is able to continue creating jobs and investing in distressed communities. Since 2005, EDA has invested about $1.2 billion, and these grants have created more than 300,000 jobs, precisely 314,000 jobs. For every dollar that is invested in EDA, we get $7 worth of private investment. That's why these jobs are created. And this legislation makes it better. It's a bipartisan bill. Senator Boxer and Inhofe and their committee have worked to get this to the Senate floor. It increases flexibilities for grantees. It lowers the threshold requirements for grantees to receive an increased federal share and makes more investments available for planning assistance. Now, Mr. President, we're trying to move through this legislation. Senator Snowe offered an amendment. She hasn't come to utter a single word about this amendment. The amendment was offered yesterday. This is the same piece of legislation that held up our Small Business Innovation Act. We've had other senators who have come and offered amendments. I don't particularly like the amendment offered by the junior senator from South Carolina, but he came and said, I want to offer this amendment. I'll agree to a time limit on it. Senator Paul, the junior senator from Kentucky, said he had an amendment he wanted to offer. He would agree to a very short time limit on it. I didn't ask for time agreements on these pieces of legislation. I should not act as the person who determines what amendments are offered and which amendments aren't offered. But when someone offers an amendment, we should be able to work it to a conclusion. And this bill, as I've indicated, is an important piece of legislation. We need to move through this. And we're going to do that to the best of our ability. We're going to have a number of votes today to do our best to move through this piece of legislation so we can move to other things. We have a lot of things we can do, and we can work on bipartisan pieces of legislation. That's my hope today. I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President, I would just say to my
Mr. O'Connell.
I suggest that before. Mr. President.
The Republican leader is recognized.
I ask that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I was just discussing with the majority leader privately the comments he made publicly about getting votes, and I've asked my members, and I understand he indicated most of our members who have amendments are willing to take short time agreements, and we ought to be able to move forward and have votes in the Senate function in the way that it should. Mr. President, with each passing day, the American people grow more concerned about our nation's future. The Washington Post ABC News poll this week said that by a ratio of 2 to 1, Americans believe we're on the wrong track, and 9 out of 10 rate the economy negatively. And yesterday's CNN poll found that many Americans expect another Great Depression. It's in this context that President Obama has started talking about how concerned he is about jobs. This week, the President said he wakes up every morning and asks himself what he can do to spur job creation. And every morning this week I've come to the floor with some suggestions for him. The fact is, many Americans have a hard time believing the President is focused on jobs when so many of his policies seem to be designed to destroy them. And in some key areas like trade, energy, and debt, the President himself has acknowledged that a reversal of his policies would create jobs and spur recovery. Let's start with trade. Hoping to sound like he had a plan for job creation, the President used the giant platform provided by his annual State of the Union message in January to declare that he'd finalized a trade agreement with South Korea that would support at least 70,000 American jobs. Yet nearly 5 months later, he sent his aides out to say that he won't sign them into law unless Congress approves billions more in government spending first. On energy, the President has acknowledged the pressure that regulations put on job creators. That's why he ordered a review of them in January. Yet by one estimate, the national energy tax his administration is trying to pass through the EPA could cost, by some estimates, millions of jobs. Millions. And while the President has acknowledged that in order to sustain economic growth and create jobs, as he put it last year, we'd need to harness traditional sources of energy, his continued refusal to issue drilling permits in the Gulf has had a devastating economic effect. On the debt, the President himself has said, and I quote, "If we don't have a serious plan to tackle the debt and the deficit, that could actually end up being a bigger drag on the economy than anything else," end quote. And yet, under his leadership, the nation's national debt has skyrocketed 35%, from $10.6 trillion to $14.2 trillion. Our deficit is 3 times bigger than the biggest annual deficit during the Bush administration, and the President refuses to put forward a serious plan to do anything to bring the debt or the deficit down. So there's a pattern here. The President likes to say that he's concerned about the economy and jobs, but his policies tell an entirely different story. He can talk all he wants, but he can't walk away from what he's done and the things he's failing to do right now to create private sector jobs and to get our economy moving again. Chief among them is his refusal to do anything to lower the debt and deficits he's done so much to create. Right now, U.S. businesses are sitting on nearly $2 trillion in cash. Most of them would love to invest this cash in new products and ventures and employees, and yet they're holding back. Why? Well, it's not just the regulations and the mixed signals they're getting about taxes or the expectation that all the spending today will necessarily lead to higher taxes tomorrow. It's also the uncertainty surrounding our future. How can businesses be confident about the future and hire new workers to build that future if the Democrats who run the White House aren't willing to do anything at all, about our deficits and our debt? Investment follows certainty. That's one thing this White House refuses to provide. And this ongoing uncertainty is paralyzing our economic recovery and seriously hindering job creation. One recent study suggests that any nation which carries a public debt load at or above 90% of its economy loses 1 point of economic growth, which the administration's own economists have said is equivalent to 1 million jobs. So why won't they propose a serious plan to lower it? When will the administration follow through on what it knows it has to do to spur job growth? The solutions, Mr. President, are right in front of us. Right in front of us. The administration acknowledges that free trade agreements, expanding domestic energy exploration, cutting regulations, providing tax certainty, and reducing the debt will lead to a dramatic increase in jobs. So why won't it follow through? Too often, unfortunately, the answer is political. They don't want to cross some special interest group, whether it's those who don't like trade agreements or those who don't like the way private companies like Boeing run their businesses, or those who just don't want to give up a single solitary penny of federal spending. But the good of the country is more important than the goals of some political interest group. We have to rein in our debt, cut spending, reduce taxes, reform entitlements, and grow this economy. This administration knows this as well as I do. It's time to act. So looking ahead, the key to success in my view and in the judgment of others, including Moody's, is for everyone involved to view the upcoming debt limit vote as an opportunity to reduce Washington's spending now and to save the taxpayers trillions of dollars over the long term. It's an opportunity to put our fiscal house in order and to prevent the fiscal crisis that we all know is coming. We know what we need to do. The time to do it is now. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half. The senator from Iowa is recognized.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to introduce a piece of legislation that I have introduced many times in past Congresses, make some progress on the goals that I seek, but not getting 100% finality of the policies that I want. And I am always able to do this with a bipartisan piece of legislation. Today I do it with Senator Johnson of South Dakota. I'll let Senator Johnson speak for himself. I want to give the reasons that I'm introducing this bill in my remarks for today. I want people to know that on most farm policy, and this deals with farm policy, that Senator from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson, and I agree on most everything on farm policy. This is a piece of legislation that's probably going to come up not so much standalone as when we discuss the reauthorization of the farm bill, which generally could start this year and probably go into next year. But I want my colleagues to know that this is an effort that I'm not giving up on. It deals with the issue of how much one individual farmer should get from the farm program. And so my approach is to put what you call a hard cap on the amount of money that one farmer can get. And my remarks will explain why. Also, though, in a time when we have great budget deficits, people might think that I'm introducing this bill just because I'm concerned about the budget deficit, because this bill, if enacted, will save about $1.5 billion. But that's not my main purpose for doing it. My main purpose is to have the historical basis for a safety net for farmers to the principle that our safety net ought to be targeted towards small and medium-sized farmers. So today, Senator Johnson and I are introducing the Rural American Preservation Act. America's farmers produce the food that feeds our families. The bill helps ensure that our farmers are able to provide a safe, abundant, and inexpensive food supply for consumers around the world while maintaining the safety net that allows small and medium-sized farmers to get through tough times. Everybody sees tough times that are out of their control. But the importance of the farm safety net can be seen no further than the dinner table that each of us sit around as recently as last night. Stop to think. If you were unable to feed your children for 3 days, because there is an old adage that says something like this, that you're only 9 meals away from a revolution. Maybe in those circumstances, if you love your children, and maybe you won't think this happens to you because we have the abundance of food so much in America. But you're aware of the fact that in a lot of countries they do have food riots when there's a shortage of food. So you might do just about anything, stealing, rioting, whatever it takes, to give those children the food that you want them to have to keep them alive after maybe not having food for 3 straight days. So the cohesion within our society, social cohesion that is one of the reasons it's vitally important that we maintain a farm program that will make sure that there's readily available food supply. Another reason I'm not going to go into in these remarks is that food is very essential to the national security of our country. In other words, the defense of our country. And all you have to do is rely upon an old adage that Napoleon used to say is that an army marches on its belly. But also more recently, you can look at the farm programs in Germany and Japan where they have in their mind the mistakes that were made for their war effort in World War II. Thank God they didn't succeed, but anyway, they did not have enough food for their military people. So I also want to think in terms of sure supply of food, not only being for social cohesion, but also for national security purposes. To ensure that the family farmer remains able to produce a food supply for this cohesive and stable society that I've talked about, we need to get the farm safety net back to its original intent to help small and medium-sized farmers get over the ups and downs of farming that are out of their control. And that could be natural disaster. It could be grain embargoes put on by the President of the United States. It could be, in the case of Nixon, freezing prices of beef and ruining the beef industry of the Midwest as an example. You got to remember, the original intent of federal farm programs was not to help farmers get bigger and bigger. But the safety net has veered sharply off course. And that's why I talk about the necessity for a hard cap on any one farmer getting help from the farm program. Because we're now seeing only 10% of the largest farmers actually getting nearly 70% of the total farm program coming out of the Treasury of the United States. There's no problem with a farmer growing larger in these operations. So let me make that clear. If you want to get bigger and bigger in America, that's an American right to do it. But the taxpayer should not have to subsidize that effort, and that's what's happening today. There comes a point where some farms reach levels that allow them to weather the tough financial times on their own. Smaller farmers do not have that same luxury. But these same small farmers play a pivotal role in producing the nation's food. I've been approached time and time again by farmers concerned about where's the next generation of farmers coming from when the price of farmland is shooting up or the price of cash rents shooting up, particularly when the federal taxpayers are subsidizing that effort. It's important that we keep young people on the farm so that they can take the lead in producing our food when the older generation of farmers is ready to turn over the reins. But the current policies that allow 10% of the largest farmers to receive nearly 70% of the total farm program payments creates a real barrier for beginning farmers. The current system puts upward pressure on land prices, making it more difficult for small and beginning farmers to buy a farm or to pay cash rent. This allows, then, the big farmers to get even bigger. And this is not unique to my state of Iowa. I'm sure it's not unique to the state of South Dakota, where my co-sponsor friend, Senator Johnson, comes from. This upward pressure on land prices is occurring in many states. It is simply good policy to have a hard cap on the amount a single farmer can receive in the farm program payments. We will keep in place a much-needed safety net for the farmers who need it the most, and it will help reduce the negative impact farm payments have on land prices and cash rent. Our bill sets the overall cap at $250,000 for married couples. Now, people listening here in the Senate or people listening back home on television probably thinks, well, that's outrageous to have a figure that high and call it a hard cap. But this is something that is national policy and may not be applicable just to my state, and it's necessary to reach some sort of common ground here in the Congress. But I recognize that agriculture can look different around the country, so this is a compromise. Just as important as setting the payment limits is a tightening of the meaning of actively engaged. And since I've used my time up, I'm not going to go into what actively engaged is about, but it means that if you're a farmer, you ought to be a farmer and not a city slicker from New York City benefiting from the farm program. I'll put the rest of my statement in the record, Mr. President, and
without objection.
And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota is recognized.
Mr. President, last week I had the opportunity to travel my state of South Dakota, as I think most senators who were home over the break did. And during the week I was able to be part of a couple of events in my state with former Comptroller General David Walker. Now, I think most people here are acquainted with Mr. Walker. He had a 10-year run as the Comptroller General of this country. He has since started an organization called Come Back America Initiative and has been traveling the country trying to explain to the public the issues surrounding our national debt, high federal spending levels, and their effect on our nation's future. And I would add that he is someone who takes both parties to task. He is an equal opportunity critic. He is very bipartisan in his criticism of the out-of-control spending that exists here in Washington, D.C. But he did point out, Mr. President, the tremendous growth in government which has occurred in the course of our nation's history. In fact, when our country was founded, if you go back that many years to the formative years of our country, and he uses the year 1800 as an example, that government spending made up just 2% of our entire economy. 2% of our GDP was represented by government spending. And today, it makes up almost 25%. And we are on a trend line, a trajectory, where that will rise to 39% by the year 2040. And so you have seen this spike, just upward spike, in the spending, the amount of federal spending as a percentage of our entire economic output. The reason for that is, he at least notes, the continuing increase in spending is primarily entitlement programs. In other words, you've got Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, which now represent about 43%. In 2010, those three programs represented 43% of our total federal spending. But again, that number is geared or set to really spike as we head into the future. He pointed out that we're set to spend more on mandatory programs than we will take in revenue in 2011. So this current year, we will spend more on mandatory programs, which include those I just mentioned, Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid, than all the revenue that the federal government will take in. So that would mean that we can't even afford to pay out the programs, the mandatory spending programs that we have in our budget, not to mention those discretionary programs, which are the other part of our federal budget. And if you look at it in terms of how much we spend today and how much we borrow, we are borrowing about 42 cents out of every dollar we spend. That's the reality that we're faced with. So it's clear that we need to make some reforms, Mr. President, particularly to the entitlement programs, to put them on a more sustainable footing. Further, Mr. Walker shared the results of his Fiscal Fitness Index, which puts the United States at 28th out of 34 developed countries, just behind Italy and just 2 places in front of Ireland. 28th out of 34 countries around the world, developed countries, in terms of our fiscal fitness. Now, Mr. Walker's message obviously is not a fun one. It's not a message that you would expect people to like to hear. It's not a message that promises more spending on people's preferred programs. Yet my constituents were eager to hear this message. Why is that, Mr. President? Well, one, he was honest. He was honest about the size of our problem, about the scope of our unfunded liabilities, about the causes of this deficit, that it is primarily a spending-driven crisis, about the effect of the health care law and health care spending in this, the measures that are needed to cut spending and to bring the budget back into balance. My constituents appreciate that kind of honesty, Mr. President. They appreciate someone telling them the truth, not simply continuing to make promises that cannot be kept. And two, they were eager to hear his message because his message offered hope. He pointed out that if the country adopted a fiscal plan that would bring down our deficits on a level that was similar to the President's Fiscal Commission's plan, our nation's rating on his fiscal fitness index would jump from 28th clear up to 8th place. He showed the attendees that there are a series of steps that we can take to fix Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that preserve these programs, these important programs, without bankrupting our country. And he showed us that if we start now, we have time to make these changes without being forced to make draconian cuts or to hike tax rates. This hope that we can fix these problems is real, and it gives the general public something that they can understand, and that was certainly the case, Mr. President, with my constituents last week. Unfortunately, there was another event that occurred last week, and that was the release of the unemployment numbers. And those numbers did not reflect hope, but instead indicated that we have a long way to go toward fixing our economy. These numbers showed that unemployment had risen to 9.1%. Further, the long-term unemployed increased to 6.2 million people, as those who are out of work are taking longer to find jobs. This long-term unemployment is particularly important for a number of reasons. One, these individuals who suffer from long-term unemployment often exhaust government and personal resources that are available to them. As a result, they are at greater risk of falling into poverty. Further, it indicates that our economy isn't sufficiently dynamic. These individuals could have skill mismatches, or there may simply not be any jobs in their local economy. And finally, the long-term unemployed may see their skills diminish and become less and less attached to the workforce. What this all means, Mr. President, is it will become harder and harder for these people to find a job as they no longer know the latest technologies or no longer have the skills that they developed by years of practice. This creates long-term challenges for our economy to be able to find these individuals jobs. So the question, Mr. President, is how? How do we create an environment where businesses and individuals can be creating jobs? Well, we know that we need to cut spending, to cut our deficit, and to cut unnecessary and harmful regulations. In a recent presentation to the University of Washington, Nobel laureate Robert Lucas pointed out that the possibility of higher taxes, the uncertainty of regulations, and the increasing role of the federal government in health care because of the health care law are all contributors to our slow economic recovery. Likewise, Dr. Lucas speculated that our economy may continue to grow at a slower rate because of the increased regulation, taxation, and spending that is moving us closer to a European welfare state. In fact, Dr. Lucas notes that these European economies have incomes that are 20 to 30% less per capita because of these differences in the size of government. It is clear that this would even further increase unemployment if we continued to move along this path. We can't just continue, Mr. President, with the status quo. We already know that the size of our debt is costing us 1 percentage point in growth every year, which, according to the White House's own economists, is the equivalent of 1 million jobs. In other words, when we sustain the kind of debt load that we have today, our gross debt as a percentage of our GDP, our entire economic output, is over 90%. That means that we're losing economic growth, and that means that we're losing jobs. We are shedding jobs as a consequence of this high level of debt and high level of spending. So we need to grow the private economy, shrink government spending, and cut our debts and deficits. This is the path that will help us a recovery, help our economy recovery, and allow it to create the jobs that are necessary to lower that unemployment rate. And we know that we can do this. There are a number of reforms and spending cuts that we are pushing to attach to the debt limit that's under discussion right now, so that we can make it easier and cheaper for individuals to create the jobs that are so necessary to get our economy back on track and to get people back to work. Now, I would simply mention, Mr. President, there are a number of things that can be done and should be done. Obviously, as I noted, spending and debt and doing something about this year-over-year $1.4, $1.5 trillion deficits, now $14.3 trillion debt that is hanging like a cloud over our economy. We have got to deal with that. And we have an opportunity, as has been noted by the leader earlier this morning, to do that in the context of this debt limit debate that we're going to have. We should view this, both sides, as an opportunity to do something meaningful about spending and debt and to put our country on a path, a more sustainable path, fiscal path for our future. But there are a number of other things that impact the economy today that should be done. One is we have 3 pending trade agreements that were negotiated 3 to 4 years ago. They have been languishing here because the White House will not send those trade agreements up here for Congress to act on. Now, just to give you an example of what that means to an agricultural state like South Dakota, Colombia is one of those 3 trade agreements, Colombia, Panama, and South Korea, all of which present markets for South Dakota agricultural products. But agricultural exports are a big part of our trade relationship with Colombia. In 2008, we had an 81% market share in Colombia. Today, that is a 27% market share, Mr. President. Could I ask unanimous consent for an additional minute to wrap up?
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
We need those trade agreements approved, Mr. President, to create jobs and to grow this economy. And so I would hope that the White House will follow through on their rhetoric and actually send those trade agreements up here so we can act on them. It has been 771 days since we passed a budget in this country, Mr. President, and the administration talks about the need to do something about spending and debt, and yet here we are, having gone 771 days without even having passed a budget, the most fundamental responsibility that we have to the taxpayers of this country. If we are serious about spending and debt, we need a budget that sets a blueprint for a more fiscally sustainable future for this country. And we need energy policies that allow us to develop energies to get American energy, to get fuel costs under control, which also impacts in a very direct way our economy and our ability to create jobs. So, Mr. President, the solutions they're out there. They're very straightforward, very simple. We need to have the will to move forward and to address these issues, and I hope that we will, because the American people expect and deserve that we will. And as Dr. Walker pointed out last week in my state of South Dakota, if we don't, we are headed for a fiscal train wreck. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah is recognized.
Mr. President, I asked for enough time to give my remarks this morning, and I asked for an equivalent amount of time to be given to the other side.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
I hope I can stay within the time constraints, but I'm not sure. Mr. President, today I'm proud to rise and offer, along with my good friend, the senior senator from Connecticut, Senator Lieberman, a continuing resolution which reaffirms our nation's steadfast and unshakable commitment to the security of Israel, specifically through the establishment of secure, recognized, and defensible borders. I am also pleased that this resolution is supported by AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. It is unfortunate that I feel compelled to offer such a resolution. For years, both Republican and Democratic administrations have recognized that Israel's boundaries of June 4th, 1967 are indefensible, and if reestablished, will create a strategic military vulnerability for our staunch ally, Israel. Mr. President, that is why President Obama's recent comments were so dumbfounding. The President's prepared and thoroughly considered remarks called for the starting point of negotiations to be what we all know are the militarily indefensible 1967 lines. Remember, if Israel returns to the 1967 lines, its territory will, in some locations, be only 9 miles wide. As Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu correctly stated in a friendly and appropriate correction to the President's remarks, the 1967 lines are not boundaries of peace, They are boundaries of repeated war. Israel would have to give up the Golan Heights, the strategic elevated location which dominates northern Israel. Does the President not remember during the 1973 war, the Syrians launched a massive armored attack on the Golan Heights, which almost succeeded? This raises the question of who President Obama was attempting to appease with his ill-advised statements, which unnecessarily drove a wedge between the United States and Israel. Mr. President, the fact is the national security interests of the United States and Israel are linked. The threats Israel faces are threats the United States faces. Whether it is Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza Strip, or these groups' benefactor Iran, we share a common foe. Unfortunately, that foe, Iran, appears to be growing stronger and more capable. Iran has repeatedly stated it wishes to wipe the United States and Israel off the map. Iran's obvious aim is to establish strategic dominance over the entire region. Their relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missile technology is of grave concern. Mr. President, much has been said about Iran's nuclear program, but much less has been articulated about its ballistic missile program. In order to achieve its strategic objectives, Iran has embarked on a significant ballistic missile program. Iranian officials have boasted that they have the ability to produce a ballistic missile with a 1,250-mile range. In 2009, the Iranians were able to launch a multi-stage space launch vehicle that the Air Force concluded, quote, can serve as a test bed for long-range ballistic missile technologies, unquote. Now, even more troubling, the Iranians appear to be developing a new long-range multi-stage solid rocket motor missile. Now, why is that important? If the Iranians successfully field this type of technology, they will be able to launch almost instantaneously missiles which carry warheads over great distances. With these ominous developments emanating from Israel's and the United States' common foes, do we really want to be seen as distancing ourselves from one of our staunchest allies, especially on such a pivotal issue as Israel's borders? This issue of these borders is only underscored by the constant attacks on Israel's borders by Iran's surrogates, Hezbollah and Hamas. Mr. President, that is why I believe this concurrent resolution is so important. It reaffirms the long-held bipartisan policy of the United States that we will, quote, support and facilitate Israel in maintaining defensible borders, and that it is contrary to the United States policy and our national security to have the borders of Israel return to the armistice lines that existed on June 4th, 1967, unquote. Now, Mr. President, the United States has no greater friend than Israel, and Israel has no greater friend than the United States. Israel too often finds herself alone in the world, unjustly singled out by the left as a nation uniquely without the moral authority to defend itself. From my perspective, Israel does not need to apologize to anyone for defending itself against those who would do her harm, and I will always stand by Israel as she seeks to protect her citizens against terrorists and their state's sponsors. Having said that, I also believe in the vast majority of Iranians, especially the young people, who do not fully appreciate the current regime that is, I think, devastating Iran and causing such problems in the Middle East. We must support those people who are searchers for freedom. Now, the security of both our nations is irrevocably linked. This bipartisan concurrent resolution removes any harmful ambiguity the President's remarks a while ago might have caused. The United States simply must stand by Israel. With his remarks last week, President Obama undermined her. Israel faces consistent, unprovoked aggression by longtime supporters of terrorism. But Israel is not a victim. All she asks is the ability to defend herself and for free people to support her right to self-defense. This is no time for the United States to distance itself from Israel, and I will do everything I can to affirm Israel's territorial integrity and ability to protect our citizens against the unprovoked attacks of terrorist and state actors. And because Israel is a true friend, I am not surprised that this resolution has strong bipartisan support. My colleague, Senator Lieberman, and I will be joined by members of both parties who want to remind the world the United States is steadfastly committed to the security of Israel and especially our allies' ability to maintain secure, recognized, and defensible borders. Now, Mr. President, let me add some additional remarks to pay tribute to Technical Sergeant Christopher M. Soulsby of Hill Air Force Base's 75th Civil Engineer Squadron. Technical Sergeant Soulsby was killed in action near the city of Shorabak, Afghanistan. Mr. President, Technical Sergeant Soulsby was a brave and courageous man. Not only did he volunteer to serve his country, returning to the field of battle 3 times, twice in Iraq and the final tour in Afghanistan, but he volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments in the war on terrorism. He was an explosive ordnance disposal technician. Now, this is not the first time that a member of Hill's EOD flight had been killed while protecting his fellow service members from improvised explosive devices. In early 2007, 3 other members of the 75th Civil Engineering Squadron were also killed. Yet, despite this tragedy, Technical Sergeant Soulsby always returned to duty. I believe one of Utah's largest newspapers, the Standard Examiner, paid him the highest tribute when it stated, quote, "Kristen M. Soulsby died doing what he loved, saving lives," unquote. I cannot think of a better definition of a true hero. From those who knew him best, his family, friends, and fellow service members, they described him as smart and highly energetic. Growing up, he loved model rockets and radio-controlled cars and airplanes. During his 11-year career in the service, his fellow airmen came to rely upon him and his professionalism. Indeed, there's a broad consensus among Hill's EOD technicians that he was the benchmark by which all others were judged. His distinguished service also did not go unrecognized. Technical Sergeant Soulsby was the recipient of the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device and Second Oak Leaf Cluster, the Air Force Meritorious Service Medal, Purple Heart Medal, and the Air Force Commendation Medal with 1 Oak Leaf Cluster, Air Force Achievement Medal with 1 Oak Leaf Cluster, and the Air Force Combat Action Medal. I know that God will be watching over the family of this admirable man. He gave his life so that others might live. Technical Sergeant Christopher M. Soulsby will never be forgotten. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
A quorum call continues on the floor of the Senate this morning. Senators gavelled in about an hour ago at 9:30 for an hour of morning business. And in a couple of minutes, senators will resume consideration of a bill reauthorizing economic development programs. Yesterday, lawmakers rejected an amendment offered by Democrat of Montana, John Tester, delaying the capping of debit card fees. Those caps, which were passed into law last year as part of the financial overhaul bill, are due to go into effect next month. That amendment would have delayed them for another year. So today there are at least 5 amendments pending. Votes are possible throughout the day, and we're bringing you live coverage of the Senate here on C-SPAN 2. The House continuing in their week-long Memorial Day break. They return this morning for a quick pro forma session, no legislative business taken up. You can see the House when they return on our companion network C-SPAN. Right now, though, in the House, Leon Panetta is appearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee. They're holding a confirmation hearing for him to be the 23rd Secretary of Defense. Defense Secretary Robert Gates is stepping down this month. He served 5 years under 2 consecutive administrations, and you can see live coverage of that confirmation hearing right now on our companion network, C-SPAN.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask that the proceedings of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, once again I come to the floor and to celebrate and recognize the contribution of our federal employees. I do this on a regular basis because while we debate the issues of the day and grapple with issues around debt and deficit, the issues that will require us to cut back on government spending, I think it's important that we remember that there are literally millions of Americans who work in one form or another for our federal government, that day in and day out, from our armed services to folks who work within this Capitol complex, to folks who work within Health and Human Services, who work in research, who make enormous contributions to our nation. And we should not lose sight of those facts as we grapple with issues around debt and deficit and the host of other issues that we deal with in this body. So today I rise to honor another great federal employee, Rafat Ansari. Mr. Ansari is a senior scientist and leading innovator at NASA's Glenn Research Center in Cleveland. He has been recognized for developing a safe, non-invasive laser device that could drastically improve the early detection of cataracts and improve people's lives in the process. Cataracts are the leading cause of vision loss and blindness in the United States and the world. They affect over 22 million Americans over the age of 40. and over $6.8 billion is spent annually in the United States on cataract treatment. Mr. Ansari was motivated to help cataract patients after his father was diagnosed with the disease. He began researching the disease and realized that cataracts are caused by proteins in the lens that cluster abnormally, a process similar to what he was studying in his space experiments. Lacking the necessary financial resources, he began conducting research in his home kitchen using a light scattering device which was able to identify clustered proteins in the eye lens. These kitchen experiments ultimately led to Mr. Ansari's invention of an innovative eye scanning device and procedure that is at least 2 or 3 times stronger than any device on the market. His invention also has the potential to significantly improve the ability to detect early signs of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, and many other diseases. The procedure is currently used by NASA to study the long-term consequences of space travel on the vision of astronauts. Mr. Ansari's personal story is a testament to all that continues to make our nation great. Born in Pakistan, Mr. Ansari always dreamt of working for NASA. Not only was he able to realize this dream of working for our government, working for NASA, but in the process, he has made discoveries that could have a big impact on the lives of millions of people, not only here in the United States, but around the world. I hope my colleagues will join me in honoring Mr. Ansari, as well as those other great scientists and engineers at NASA for their excellence and service to our nation. Mr. President, again, one more time, I want to acknowledge not only Mr. Ansari, but all of our federal workers. I think it's important that as we, and as somebody who's been very involved and hoping to do more on this issue of debt and deficit, we will have to make substantial cutbacks in how government spends and operates. But I think we need to remember as we talk about some of these cuts that we are affecting the lives of literally millions of good Americans who try to keep the functions of this government working on an efficient, honest, and ethical basis day in and day out. So that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.